On Friday, the 6th of March, the sixth day of my marriage, the bank's confirmation came through at the center. I watched Aisha reconcile the account, printed the record, and set it beside the original transfer. The loss was zero! Yet my hands still shook as I reached for the document that would end both my business partnership and the marriage I had entered less than a week earlier. By then, £26,000 had returned to where it belonged. The real story began when that same sum vanished, and my husband claimed I had given him permission. The wind caught my veil outside Brighton Town Hall and wrapped it around Martin's face, just as Helen tried to take our photograph. He stood there, laughing through a sheet of ivory tulle, while drizzle silvered the shoulders of his navy suit. And for a few seconds, none of us could move, because we were laughing too hard. It was Sunday, the 1st of March, 2026, and after 26 years together, Martin Bennett and I had finally become husband and wife. At 51, I thought I knew exactly whom I had married. I had shared a home, a business, and more than half my adult life with him. I'm telling this aloud because silence can make even an intelligent woman doubt what she saw with her own eyes. If stories about trust, control, and the moment one turns into the other matter to you, please subscribe and stay with me. Our wedding was deliberately small. I teach English at a secondary school in Brighton, and the idea of performing my private life before a room full of distant cousins and curious colleagues made me itch. Martin, who was 53, said he felt the same. Helen Ward, my closest friend and a solicitor, served as my witness. Martin's father, Peter, was his. Aisha Khan, our tutoring center's accountant, came with a dark green umbrella that turned inside out before she reached the entrance. Even the registrar laughed when Aisha carried the broken thing inside like the skeleton of some unfortunate sea creature. The ceremony lasted less time than one of my Year 10 lessons. Martin's hands were warm when he slid the ring onto my finger, and his voice caught slightly on the vows. That moved me more than I expected. He was not an openly sentimental man. He showed affection by checking the boiler pressure, replacing my bus pass before it expired, or leaving a mug beside my marking pile without interrupting me. When he promised to love and respect me, I believed him, with the confidence of someone who had collected 26 years of evidence. If trust had been an exam question, I would have written pages. We held lunch in a narrow restaurant near the seafront, where the windows rattled in the gusts and the waiter kept rescuing paper napkins from the floor. Pip, my scruffy rescue mongrel, was not allowed inside, so our neighbor had agreed to keep him for the afternoon. I missed the familiar pressure of his rough head against my knee. Martin noticed me glancing toward the door and squeezed my wrist. "He'll survive 3 hours without supervising you," he said. I told him Pip considered supervision his full-time profession. Martin smiled, but his fingers stayed around my wrist a little longer than the joke required. Peter made the only speech. At 76, he had a careful, formal way of speaking, as if every family occasion required minutes. He welcomed me to the Bennett family, then corrected himself because, as he admitted, I had already been attending their Christmas lunches for more than 2 decades. Martin looked down at his plate while everyone laughed. Peter ended by saying that marriage was about making one household from 2 lives. I saw Martin nod at that phrase. It seemed harmless, even tender, though Helen caught my eye across the table and lifted one eyebrow. Helen had always watched Martin more closely than my other friends did. She was 50, sharp without being cruel, and professionally incapable of ignoring an imprecise sentence. Years earlier, when Martin and I opened a tutoring center near Brighton Station, she had insisted that our partnership agreement spell out who owned what and who could authorize payments. Martin had called her suspicious. Helen had replied that suspicion was simply caution wearing reading glasses. They respected each other, but neither had ever pretended to be fond of the other, and I had spent years smoothing the space between them. The center was only 2 miles from my terraced house in Hove, but it had become the second address of our relationship. I taught at the school during the day, a journey of 3 miles that usually took about 20 minutes by bus. Then worked at the center on selected evenings. Martin managed bookings, premises, and most of the practical administration. I designed the English programs, recruited tutors, and handled parents who believed one missed homework sheet had destroyed their child's future. Aisha kept the accounts so clean that she could locate a misplaced receipt faster than I could find my reading glasses. My school salary brought home £3,050 each month. I had never hidden that from Martin, just as he had never hidden the center's figures from me. We paid shared household costs by standing order and kept our personal accounts separate, an arrangement that had worked through broken washing machines, lean business months, and one spectacular roof leak. Marriage, I assumed, would change our legal status and give us a reason to buy a cake. It would not suddenly erase habits that had served us well for 26 years. Martin had never objected to that understanding in plain words. After lunch, Peter handed us a parcel wrapped in cream paper printed with tiny gold bells. It was soft on one side and oddly stiff on the other, with old-fashioned brown tape reinforcing the corners. "Something from the family," he told Martin. His face had gone unreadable, and he would not say more. Martin placed it beneath his chair without opening it. When I asked whether we should look, he said we could do it at home, then pushed it farther back with his heel, as if he did not want Helen noticing it. Aisha left first because the weather was worsening. Before she went, she hugged me and murmured that the quarterly figures were ready whenever I wanted them. Martin, standing beside us, answered for me. "Claire won't need to bother with those this week. I'm taking the weight off her now." His tone was light, and Aisha gave a polite smile, but I felt a small internal tug. I told her I would review everything on Tuesday evening as usual. Martin's smile held, though it no longer reached his eyes. He said, "Of course," and kissed my temple in front of her. Helen waited until Martin and Peter had gone to settle the restaurant bill. She turned her coffee cup by its handle and asked whether we had agreed to any financial changes after the wedding. I laughed, partly because the question seemed so aggressively Helen. "We agreed to stop referring to each other as partners and confusing people at the center," I said. She did not laugh. She reminded me that marriage and a business partnership were separate things, and I assured her I knew. Then Martin returned, laid his hand on the back of my chair, and asked what legal disaster Helen was predicting now. "Only bad paperwork," Helen said, looking directly at him. Martin replied that he intended to simplify things, not complicate them. When I asked what things, he brushed the crumb from the tablecloth and said he meant the emergency contacts, insurance forms, and all the dull administrative debris of getting married. That sounded reasonable. Helen accepted it with a nod that was not agreement so much as temporary adjournment. Outside, she hugged me beneath the restaurant awning and told me to call if I needed anything. I teased her for making my wedding sound like the opening of a case file. Martin and I walked home along wet Hove streets rather than waiting for a bus. He carried the family parcel under one arm, and I held my skirt above the puddles while the wind shoved salt spray over the railings. Our wedding bands looked unnaturally bright against our cold hands. We talked about leftover cake, Pip, and whether marriage entitled him to become even worse at loading the dishwasher. It felt reassuringly ordinary. At one crossing, he took my hand and said, "No more his money and her money now." I thought he was joking and answered, "Fine, you can start paying for my classroom books." He did not laugh. He said a married couple should not behave like suspicious flatmates, especially at our age. I reminded him that separate accounts had never made us suspicious. They had made bookkeeping easier. He changed the subject before the pedestrian light turned green. By the time we reached my street, Pip was barking from behind our neighbor's front door, and the sound broke the tension. Martin crouched to let him jump against his coat, complaining about muddy paws while rubbing both sides of the dog's neck. I told myself I had mistaken seriousness for tiredness. At home, I changed out of my dress and hung it from the wardrobe door because the hem was damp. Martin opened a bottle of sparkling wine we had been given at lunch, though neither of us wanted much. Pip circled the kitchen twice and collapsed beneath the radiator. Our house smelled of wet wool, toast from that morning, and the lilies Peter had sent ahead. I looked around at the familiar chipped tile by the sink and the stack of essays on the sideboard. Nothing in the room suggested that a legal ceremony could have altered the balance of my life. Martin finally opened Peter's parcel at the kitchen table. Inside was a faded floral apron, neatly folded around an old wooden recipe box. The fabric was yellowed at the neck, and one pocket had been repaired with uneven blue stitches. Martin held it by the straps for several seconds. He told me it had belonged to his mother, who had worn it while living in her father's house. In 1996, she had begun handing her wages to that domineering man, and she remained under his roof for 30 years. Martin spoke without sympathy or anger, as though reciting a family rule. I touched the patched pocket and said it was sad that no one had helped her leave. Martin folded the apron again, more sharply than necessary. She understood that one person has to be in charge, he said. I stared at him, waiting for the qualification that never came. Then he put the apron on the back of a kitchen chair and carried the recipe box upstairs. The fabric hung there like an empty body. Pip raised his head and gave a low, uncertain whine before settling again. That night, Martin slept quickly, one hand resting on my side of the mattress, as if claiming the space even after I moved away from it. Rain tapped the bedroom window, and somewhere toward the seafront, a loose sign knocked at irregular intervals. I lay awake, thinking about the phrase, "One person has to be in charge." On Monday morning, I woke to the sound of my purse being unzipped. Martin was standing by the bedroom chair in his work clothes, holding my wallet open beneath the bedside lamp. For one foolish second, I assumed he was looking for cash to pay the milkman. Then he removed my debit card, my credit card, and the store cards tucked behind them. He stuck them neatly in his palm and slipped them into the inside pocket of his coat. The wedding ring on his hand flashed as he pressed the pocket closed. "What are you doing?" I asked. My voice sounded thick with sleep, but fear had already cleared my head. Martin said married couples should not maintain competing financial loyalties. He spoke calmly, almost pleasantly, while I sat up and pulled the duvet around myself. I told him those were my cards attached to accounts in my name, and he must return them immediately. Instead, he picked up my phone from the bedside table. I snatched it before he could unlock it, and his expression changed. It was not rage. Rage would have been easier to recognize. What crossed his face was irritation at a household object that had failed to behave. "Your salary is £3,050 a month," he said. "There is no reason for you to control all of it yourself anymore." "All of it?" I repeated. Martin explained that he would handle the household finances, the center's money, and any major purchases. I could ask him when I needed something. He made it sound like an administrative adjustment, no more dramatic than moving a direct debit. I got out of bed and held out my hand. "Give me my cards." He refused, saying he was trying to protect us from confusion and duplication. When I said taking property from my wallet was not protection, he sighed and told me not to use Helen's legal vocabulary inside our marriage. That was when the doorbell rang downstairs, followed by Pip's frantic barking. Helen had arranged to stop by for coffee because I had taken Monday off school. She arrived carrying the folder containing our spare wedding photographs and the scarf I had left at the restaurant. I met her in the hallway wearing my dressing gown, with Pip squeezing between my ankles. One look at my face wiped the greeting from hers. Before I could explain, Martin came down carrying the faded floral apron. He greeted Helen with stiff politeness, then told her it was not a good morning for visitors. Helen looked from the apron to his buttoned coat and asked me, not him, whether I wanted her to leave. I said no. Martin placed the apron over the banister and told Helen that his wife and he were discussing private financial arrangements. Helen asked whether those arrangements involved the cards visible through the open edge of his coat pocket. He pushed the pocket flat with one hand. I told her what he had taken. She did not raise her voice. She simply said he needed to return every card and that withholding access to my own money could amount to coercive control. Martin opened the front door so abruptly that it struck the wall. "You have spent years interfering in this relationship," he said. "Get out of my house." "It is Claire's house too," Helen replied. Martin snatched her scarf from the hall table, thrust it toward her, and ordered her outside. When she did not move, he took her by the elbow and steered her across the threshold. Helen twisted free before he could push her, but the intention was unmistakable. Pip barked until his front paws slid on the floorboards. I stepped between Martin and the door, and Helen told me she would remain nearby if I wanted to leave. Martin said I was not going anywhere until we had finished our conversation. Then he shut the door in her face and turned the key. Have you ever watched someone you trusted change the rules the moment they thought you could no longer walk away? If you have lived through anything like that, share your story in the comments. That morning, the most frightening thing was not Martin's volume. It was how thoroughly prepared he seemed to be. I demanded that he unlock the door. He did, but kept the key in his hand and accused me of creating drama for Helen's benefit. I reminded him that less than 24 hours earlier, he had promised to respect me. He said respect did not mean allowing me to undermine him. Then he lifted his mother's apron from the banister, shook it open, and held it toward me. The fabric gave off a stale smell of cardboard and old cooking oil. "Put this on," he said. "You need to understand what being part of this family means." I refused, thinking the word no still possessed its ordinary meaning. Martin's mouth tightened. He said his mother had understood duty, unlike women who treated independence as a weapon. I asked whether he meant the same mother whose wages had been surrendered to a man who made her unhappy. His answer came with such cold certainty that the hallway seemed to narrow around us. My grandfather made my mother miserable, and she put up with it for 30 years. "You live the same way." He pressed the apron into my chest. Pip growled from behind my legs, and Martin glanced down at him with open contempt. I had never heard him describe cruelty as an inheritance before. "No," I said. "I will not wear it, and I will not hand you my wages." Martin told me I was already wearing his ring and enjoying the legal security of being his wife, so I could stop behaving like an unattached woman. He said the apron was not punishment, but a reminder that a home needed order. When I tried to walk past him, he blocked the narrow hallway and asked whether I wanted Pip shut in the back room while we talked. It was a small threat, carefully chosen. I put the apron on because I wanted the dog away from his temper, and because fear sometimes makes compliance feel like strategy. The neck loop scratched my skin. Martin tied the straps behind me himself, pulling them tight enough to bunch my dressing gown at the waist. He stepped back and looked satisfied, not amused. That look injured me more deeply than the order. After 26 years, he had imagined this scene and believed I would eventually fit inside it. He told me to make breakfast while he reviewed our accounts. I went into the kitchen, not because I accepted his authority, but because my phone was in my dressing gown pocket and Helen was waiting somewhere outside. As I filled the kettle, I sent her 3 words beneath the counter. "Do not leave." Martin sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and the old recipe box beside it. He asked for the passcode to my banking app. I told him he was not getting it. He replied that resistance was embarrassing at my age and that he intended to move my salary into a household structure he could supervise. I said any transfer without my consent would be reported. For a moment, his face softened and he came behind me as though he meant to embrace me. "I wanted to put things right for us," he murmured. "You carry too much, and I thought taking charge would make your life easier." It was his version of claiming he meant well. That gentleness offered me a false ledge to stand on. I asked him to give the cards back, remove the apron, and sit down with me like the man I had known. He touched my shoulder and said we could reset the morning if I stopped involving outsiders. I believed, for perhaps half a minute, that he had frightened himself with his own behavior. Then he said Helen could no longer visit without his permission. Aisha should report business figures directly to him, and I needed to sign authority allowing him to manage my personal accounts. The apology I had been waiting for was merely a softer route to the same destination. I untied the apron and dropped it onto the kitchen table. Martin caught my wrist before I could step away. He did not squeeze hard enough to leave an obvious mark, which somehow told me this was not loss of control. It was control measured precisely. I told him to let go. He asked whether I was prepared to destroy 26 years over cards and a piece of fabric. I answered that he was the one doing the destroying. We remained like that until Pip barked sharply at him. Martin released me, smoothed his cuff, and said he had work to do at the tutoring center. Before leaving, he picked up the apron and draped it over the back of the chair again. My cards remained in his coat. He told me he would return them that evening if I had calmed down and apologized for humiliating him in front of Helen. I said there would be no apology. He looked directly at me and replied, "You did not refuse. You became upset and misunderstood what I was offering." I repeated his exact threat about his mother and 30 years of misery. He smiled without warmth and said I had imagined it because I had spent the night brooding over a family story. The front door closed behind him, and I heard his footsteps recede along the wet pavement. Helen knocked almost immediately. She had been sitting in her car within sight of the house, watching the door. When I let her in, her cheeks were blotched with anger and rain. She asked whether Martin had hurt me. I said no, then looked at the pale line around my wrist and corrected myself. Not badly. Helen photographed the mark with my permission. She also photographed the apron where it hung over the chair, the wedding parcel on the floor, and the empty slots in my wallet. I wanted to believe the crisis had paused. Martin was out of the house, my phone was still mine, and Helen was standing in my kitchen. I even laughed once, a brittle sound, when Pip carried one of Martin's slippers into the room and dropped it at Helen's feet. She did not laugh. She told me to write down every sentence I could remember while the wording was fresh. I was halfway through recording his claim that I had imagined my own refusal when my phone began vibrating across the table. Aisha's name appeared on the screen. Her first words were, "Claire, did you authorize a transfer from the center?" My stomach tightened. I said I had authorized nothing and asked what had happened. Aisha went quiet, and in that pause I could hear office sounds behind her. A printer running, a chair rolling, the muted announcement from Brighton station beyond the windows. £26,000 has gone, Aisha said. She had checked twice before calling me. The money had been transferred that afternoon from the tutoring center's operating account into an account Martin controlled. 20,000 was the capital I had put into the business. The remaining 6,000 was my share of retained profit. Aisha could see Martin's login attached to the transaction, but she could not reverse it herself. I gripped the edge of the table until the apron's faded flowers blurred beneath my eyes. Less than a day after promising to respect me, my husband had taken every pound I owned in the center. Helen pulled out a chair before my knees gave way. Aisha kept speaking, her accountant's voice precise, even though I could hear anger tightening it. Martin had arrived at the center alone, told the receptionist that I was taking the week away from business matters, and shut himself in the office. Aisha challenged the transfer as soon as it appeared, but he said I had approved a restructuring after our wedding. When she asked to see written authority, he told her that a wife's consent did not need to be presented to an employee. Then he left with his laptop before she could confront him again. I asked Aisha whether the center could still pay its immediate bills. She said there was enough in the account to keep the doors open for the moment, but the missing money could not be treated as an ordinary withdrawal. Our partnership agreement required proper authority for a transfer of that nature, and she had already preserved the transaction record. Helen moved the phone onto speaker and asked Aisha not to contact Martin again until we had secured the evidence. Hearing them speak in calm professional terms should have steadied me. Instead, shame swept over me so violently that I pressed both hands against my face. That money represented years of evening lessons, marked essays, anxious parents, and students arriving convinced they were stupid because one exam had frightened them. I had built programs at the kitchen table while Martin slept upstairs. I had taken extra schoolwork instead of drawing more from the center during difficult months. Yet my first thought was not that Martin had stolen from me. It was that perhaps I had provoked him by refusing the apron, embarrassing him before Helen, or failing to detect whatever grievance had been growing behind his ordinary face. That is what control does first. It recruits your own conscience against you. My phone chimed while Aisha was explaining the account history. Martin had written that he had moved our money somewhere safer because I was emotional and Helen was manipulating me. A second message arrived before I finished reading the first. He said I had agreed that morning to let him take responsibility, then warned that accusing him of theft could damage the center's reputation. I showed the screen to Helen. She photographed both messages and told me not to answer impulsively. I wanted to type that I had agreed to nothing, but Martin had already begun manufacturing a version of the morning in which my refusal had never happened. Helen asked me to say aloud what I wanted, without considering the wedding, the business, or the 26 years behind us. My mouth opened, but no answer came. I could teach teenagers how to distinguish a fact from an interpretation, yet I could not separate my husband from the man who had blocked a hallway and tied an old apron around me. Pip leaned his weight against my shin, trembling whenever a vehicle slowed outside. I bent to stroke him and noticed that my hands smelled faintly of the stale fabric. I went to the sink and scrubbed them until the skin across my knuckles turned pink. For several minutes, I could not stop shaking. Helen filled the glass with water, but it clicked against my teeth when I tried to drink. She suggested I pack a bag and stay elsewhere that night. The thought of leaving my own house while Martin returned with my cards in his pocket made something inside me recoil. Still, the alternative frightened me too. He had changed so quickly that I no longer knew which version would enter through the door. The quiet man who checked the boiler, or the one who threatened me with 30 years of misery. Both wore the same wedding ring. Aisha emailed the transaction records to a secure address Helen provided, then changed the center's bookkeeping password and preserved the access logs. She could not simply seize control of the bank account, but she could prevent Martin from altering invoices or deleting the supporting records she managed. Helen advised her to write a factual account of everything he had said and done that afternoon. I listened while two women protected the business I had helped create, and the contrast was unbearable. Martin had called them interfering employees and outsiders. In that kitchen, they were the only people treating my words as real. We turned next to my personal cards. Because I still had my phone and could verify my identity, I froze the debit and credit cards remotely and contacted the issuers about the store cards. The process was strangely mundane. Menus asked whether the cards were lost, stolen, or temporarily misplaced, as if there ought to have been a box marked "taken by husband on second day of marriage." Once each card was blocked, its image changed inside the app. Martin still possessed the plastic, but it had become useless to him. That small fact gave me my first clean breath of the day. The bank's fraud team recorded my report about the business transfer, but would not promise an immediate return. The transaction had to be examined under the partnership mandate, and the formal recovery process would begin on Tuesday. Helen had me note the reference details without reading them aloud to anyone else. When the call ended, I stared at the dark phone screen and saw myself reflected in it. Hair uncombed, dressing gown creased, wedding ring bright against the hand holding evidence of financial abuse. 24 hours earlier, strangers had congratulated me. Now I was afraid to draw the front curtains in case a neighbor asked how married life felt. Martin called repeatedly. We let the first calls ring out. Then Helen suggested recording a later one if I felt able to answer. When I finally did, he sounded irritated rather than ashamed. He said Aisha had overreacted and demanded to know whether I had spoken to the bank. I asked where the £26,000 was. He replied that it had never been mine alone and accused me of using legal tricks to punish him. When I repeated that I had explicitly refused his financial arrangement, he said, "You were hysterical, Claire. You don't remember the conversation properly." Helen sat opposite me, writing every word. He then lowered his voice and tried tenderness again. He said he had wanted to make married life easier, that he had watched his mother carry responsibilities no woman should have had to manage, and that I would thank him once I stopped panicking. The contradiction was grotesque. That morning he had praised her endurance, now he used her suffering as an excuse for taking charge. I asked him to return the money before coming home. He said he would discuss it when I was alone and reasonable. Then he asked whether Helen was listening. I did not answer, and he disconnected. If you had been sitting in my kitchen, would you have chosen 1, leave immediately, or 2, give him one chance to return everything and explain himself? Put your number in the comments, because I know how obvious the answer may look from outside. By the end, you will understand why I stayed silent for as long as I did, even after that Monday stripped away every excuse I had made for him. The unexpected call came from Peter. I nearly ignored it because I assumed Martin had recruited his father to lecture me. But Helen nodded toward the phone and switched on her recorder after I consented. Peter did not ask about an argument. He asked whether Martin had made me wear the apron. The accuracy of the question chilled me. I said yes. Peter breathed out slowly and told me he had given Martin the parcel only because Martin had requested it before the wedding. Martin had claimed he wanted to preserve something belonging to his mother and surprised me with a piece of family history. Peter said the apron had never symbolized duty to Martin's mother. It symbolized captivity. She had worn it in her father's house because he expected service after taking her wages, and Peter had failed to help her escape that arrangement. His voice broke when he admitted that failure. Martin, already an adult in 1996, had watched the household operate through fear and later began speaking of it as proof that feminists needed a single authority. Peter had challenged him more than once. Martin always dismissed the criticism by saying modern women exaggerated control because they had forgotten sacrifice. Then Peter told me why he had called. Martin had phoned him from the center and announced that marriage was already settling me. He had mentioned taking my cards and said I would eventually be grateful when Helen was no longer influencing me. Peter had demanded that he return them. Martin laughed and said his grandfather had maintained a household for 30 years without asking permission from anyone. Peter ended the call, found my number, and rang me directly. He apologized for placing the apron in that wedding parcel and offered to provide a written statement about Martin's call and the earlier conversations. That was the moment my fear changed shape. It did not disappear, it hardened into purpose. Martin had not suffered a strange morning of confusion. He had asked for the apron before our wedding. He had chosen the object, rehearsed its meaning, and waited until the ceremony made him feel entitled to use it. I removed my wedding ring and placed it beside the wooden recipe box. Then I asked Peter to write down exactly what Martin had said, email it to Helen, and preserve any messages concerning the parcel. He agreed without hesitation. For the first time all day, I gave an instruction without apologizing for it. Helen found a clean document bag in her case. Wearing gloves from the household cleaning cupboard, I folded the apron along its existing creases and placed it inside. The wedding parcel, its brown tape, and the patched pocket remained visible through the clear plastic. That apron had arrived as a family keepsake, become a forced uniform, and now sat sealed as evidence. I wrote the date and circumstances on a sheet Helen attached to the bag. My handwriting wavered at first, then steadied. Pip watched from beneath the table, his chin resting on Martin's abandoned slipper. We spent the remaining afternoon building a record Martin could not rewrite. Aisha sent the transfer confirmation, the access history, and her signed account of his claim that I had authorized him. Peter's email arrived with details of Martin's call and his request for the apron before the wedding. I saved Martin's messages in more than one place, changed the passwords to my email and personal banking, and removed his access wherever I could do so lawfully. Helen arranged for copies to be stored away from the house. Every click closed the door he had assumed would remain open. As daylight faded, the front room turned gray and the wind drove fine rain against the windows. Helen wanted me to leave before Martin returned, but I had made a decision. I would not face him alone, and I would not be driven out of my own home. Helen agreed to stay, provided we treated the evening as a controlled meeting rather than a test of courage. Aisha closed the tutoring center and came over with printed copies of the transaction records. Peter arrived shortly afterward, pale beneath his rain-spotted cap, carrying the email he had sent us. We placed our phones where they could record openly, kept the front door unobstructed, and agreed that anyone would call the police if Martin threatened me or tried to prevent me leaving. The apron remained sealed on the kitchen table. At 20 minutes to 7 on Monday evening, the second day of our marriage, Martin's key scraped in the front lock. Pip rose beside my chair, every hair along his spine lifting. Martin entered with his laptop case over one shoulder and rain shining on his coat. He stopped when he saw Helen, Aisha, and Peter seated around the table. His gaze traveled to my bare ring finger, then to the evidence bag. Finally, he reached into his coat and dropped my cards beside it. "I regret taking your cards," he said. The words sounded practiced, but his anger showed in the white pressure around his mouth. He had discovered that the cards were frozen when he tried to use one, and his access to the center's bookkeeping, email, and disputed funds had been restricted. He demanded that Aisha restore his credentials. She told him, steadily, that she would not alter preserved business records while an unauthorized transfer was under investigation. Martin called it a misunderstanding between spouses. Helen slid the partnership agreement across the table and pointed to the requirement he had ignored. Then Peter placed his statement beside it. For the first time, Martin seemed to understand that he had not come home to a frightened wife waiting for permission to buy groceries. He had walked into a room full of witnesses. Martin looked at me and claimed I had consented to the transfer. I played the recording of our afternoon call, including his insistence that I did not remember refusing him. Helen displayed the photographs of my empty wallet and wrist. Aisha showed him the login record, linking him to the £26,000 transfer. Peter confirmed that Martin had requested the apron before the wedding and had boasted about taking my cards. Each piece removed another place for him to hide. He tried to say Peter was confused, Aisha was insubordinate, and Helen had poisoned me against him. He could discredit one woman in his imagination, but not an entire table of evidence. When he saw the apron through the clear bag, he lost the careful tone. He said it belonged to his family and ordered me to hand it over. I told him it would remain preserved with the other evidence. Martin struck the table with his palm, making the cards jump against the wood. Pip lunged forward with a bark, and Peter stood between us before I could move. The sight of his elderly father shielding me seemed to shame Martin more than anything I had said. Peter told him quietly that he had watched one generation confuse domination with duty and would not stand by while another repeated it. Martin's shoulders dropped, but he still tried one final revision. He said nothing violent had happened. The money had remained within the marriage, and I had worn the apron voluntarily. I picked up my written account and read back the threat he had denied making. He interrupted to say I was twisting a family memory. That was when I looked directly at the man I had loved for 26 years and answered the sentence he had intended as my future. No, Martin, you live with what you did. Nobody spoke after that. Rain hissed against the back window, and somewhere in the kitchen the refrigerator motor clicked off. Martin stared at me, as though refusal were a language he had never expected me to speak fluently. Helen then told him that further communication about the business and separation should be recorded or made through solicitors. I told him our marriage was over, and so was our business partnership. I did not claim the legal processes could be completed that night. I made the personal decision unmistakable. He could collect essential belongings without approaching me, and Peter agreed to remain upstairs while he did it. Helen and Aisha stayed in the kitchen while Martin packed. Peter stood on the landing, giving him space, but making sure he did not enter the room where I waited with Pip. Martin came down carrying a whole dough and asked for 5 minutes with me. I agreed only in the open front room with the others nearby. He lowered his voice until it was almost gentle. I thought that if I carried every decision, you'd never have to feel the fear my mother lived with, he said. There were no witnesses close enough to hear that quiet confession, and I believe he meant it. He had tried to cure helplessness by making me helpless. I told him protection did not require stolen cards, blocked doorways, forced consent, or £26,000 moved behind my back. He flinched at the word stolen, then asked whether one terrible day truly outweighed 26 years. I said the day had revealed what he believed those years entitled him to own. He glanced toward the kitchen, where the useless cards lay beside the sealed apron, and asked whether there was any path back. I told him there could be accountability, but there would be no return to our marriage. Peter took the holdall, and Martin followed him into the wet evening without saying goodbye. The house did not feel victorious after the door closed. It felt stunned. I checked every room, even though I knew Martin had left. Then sat on the stairs and shook so hard that my heels knocked against the riser. Helen remained until Peter confirmed by phone that Martin was staying away. Aisha made tea. None of us drank, and checked the center's records once more before going home. Pip slept pressed against my bedroom door that night. I did not sleep at all. Every pipe settling in the walls sounded like a key entering the lock, and dawn found me sitting upright with the lamp still on. On Tuesday, the 3rd of March, the bank formally began recovery of the £26,000. Its investigators had the transfer details, the partnership mandate, Aisha's preserved logs, my immediate report, and Martin's messages claiming authority I had never granted. Helen helped me separate the financial dispute from the end of the relationship, so Martin could not use one negotiation to bargain with the other. I also informed the school that I was dealing with a serious domestic matter. I hated speaking those words, but the head teacher arranged cover without pressing me for details. Shame began loosening its grip each time someone accepted my account without asking what I had done to provoke him. Martin sent one long message that afternoon. He apologized for frightening me, but continued to describe the transfer as temporary and the cards as a misguided attempt to organize our finances. He wanted us to attend counseling before I made anything permanent. I replied through Helen that the missing money must be returned, all business access would remain restricted during the investigation, and I would not meet him privately. After that, his solicitor handled the practical communication. The cards themselves were already back, but they were only pieces of plastic now. I cut them through the chips and requested replacements with new numbers. At the tutoring center, Martin's absence exposed how much of the daily administration had depended on habits rather than documented procedures. Aisha and I spent exhausting hours securing files, contacting tutors, and reassuring staff without sharing private allegations unnecessarily. Martin agreed to withdraw from operations while the partnership was being brought to an end, largely because the records left him little room to argue. Several people who had once admired his efficiency stopped returning his calls after learning that he had falsely invoked my consent. Peter continued speaking to his son, but he refused to defend him. That refusal cost them whatever easy relationship they had possessed. Friday, the 6th of March, brought the first result that felt solid. The bank returned all £26,000 to the centre's account. I watched Aisha reconcile it. £20,000 of my capital and £6,000 of retained profit, restored in full. The loss was zero. I printed the confirmation and placed it beside the original transfer record, not because I doubted the screen, but because paper felt wonderfully difficult to gaslight. That same day, I formally ended my personal relationship with Martin and instructed that our business partnership be terminated under the agreement Helen had once insisted we write. Ending a marriage begun 5 days earlier still required proper legal steps. Declarations spoken in a kitchen do not erase a marriage certificate. The solicitors handled the paperwork over the months that followed, while Martin and I remained apart. The evidence meant there was little appetite for a prolonged dispute over the business, and he eventually paid £1,200 in legal fees. He lost his role at the center, his access to its systems, and the assumption that Peter would always excuse him. I lost the person I thought I had known, along with the easy trust I had carried through more than half my adult life. Helen asked whether I wanted the apron returned once it was no longer needed as evidence. I nearly told her to destroy it. Instead, I kept it sealed until every legal and financial matter was concluded. Then I opened the bag in daylight, at the kitchen table where Martin had tried to make it a uniform. I washed the fabric carefully and hung it outside in the sun. The stain had gone, but the crease from the evidence bag remained. I did not iron it out. By autumn, the divorce was final and the center was operating as a company in my name, with Aisha promoted to manager and every financial process requiring 2 recorded approvals. Enrollment rose. Parents noticed only that the office ran more calmly. Martin moved to another town and contacted me solely through solicitors until the last document was signed. Peter visited once to return a box of photographs. We drank tea, spoke honestly, and did not pretend grief made either of us responsible for repairing his son. On the anniversary of the night Martin left the house, I wore the apron to bake bread. Pip lay beneath the table, older and grayer, waiting for crumbs. When the loaf had cooled, I cut 2 slices, carried one to Aisha at the center, and left the spare key to my house in my own pocket. That evening, I folded the apron over a chair instead of sealing it away. Lamplight crossed the kitchen floor, the kettle clicked off, and I opened the door because I had chosen to. The next story is about a daughter who discovers why her father kept one room locked for 30 years. Subscribe to hear what she finds inside.